Szanowni Państwo, drodzy przyjaciele.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, good morning. It is my unique honor to welcome you to the 25th International Conference on the Role of Christians in the Process of European Integration. Our title this year is A Lonely Europe. The organizers of the conference is the European People's Party Group in the European Parliament and the Schuman Foundation. The cycle of conferences started in a very interesting way because the idea actually to organize conference number 1 appeared in the year 2000 in the office of the Secretary to the Pope, John Paul II at that time. The idea was to have a very clear declaration of the Catholic Church before the referendum that was planned for June 2003 on Poland's membership in the European Union. We did achieve this objective. We had a turnout of almost 60%, and 6-7% of Poles voted for our membership in the European Union. May the 1st, 2004 was the day in which our accession treaty was signed. It was at that time that I believed that this was the end of this project, that the discussion here perhaps has no need to be continued. And at that time, Bishop Tadeusz Pieronek said that the European integration is a process that requires constant dialogue. Today, we keep on meeting so that we can participate in this dialogue, so that we can speak about the further process of European integration. Danuta Hübner, in her memoir book, she wrote, September is coming, it's time to pack my bags and go to Krakow and participate in the Pieronek conference. As you know, we've got here a photo of the face, a graphic image of the face of Bishop Pieronek, but actually Danuta Hübner did not draw it, but the word Pieronkalia in Polish, Pieronek conference, actually, this was her idea. You might have seen some photographs also before we started here on the big screen, showing a history of our conference. We will continue showing them. Antoni Litwicki has been with us for 25 years. For 25 years, he's been taking photographs of participants of this conference. We will continue showing those pictures to you. Antoni, thank you very much for your work here. Thank you for being with us for 25 years. Jana Rosiewska-Cieśling and Artur Kaciar from his archives have selected 150 photographs out of 12,000 actually pictures there. Thank you very much for the work you've done. We can go back in our thoughts to the history of those conferences over 25 years. I'll give the floor to Stanisław Kracik, the Deputy Mayor of the City of Krakow, to take the floor. But before I do that, let us watch a very short film. In this short film, we will see an overview of 25 years of our discussions on church, Europe and politics. I do hope that Bernadetta Cich next year is going to prepare a film on Bishop Pieronek, a unique figure, very inspiring. Bernadetta Cich is the author of this film. This is the space in which we can organize this conference. We heard about a bishop, a European, an open bishop, and we thought that he might be interested in joining us. And yes, we found Bishop Pieronek, a very active, authentic, not a modern person or focused on reforms. He's very reliable and deeply engaged in spreading faith. At the same time, an excellent lawyer, professor of law, an eminent person, author of many books, expert in church law, but also expert in European law and Polish law. So we talked about contents only. I'm not really a hero. I don't feel like a hero. I'm just a normal person. Somewhat twisted, perhaps a bit. Then we won the referendum. We continued with European integration. We thought, that's it, that's the end. But then Bishop Pieronek actually said that European integration is a process. There will be a number of troubles and challenges ahead. For this reason, as we are engaged in this dialogue, we should perhaps create this space for further dialogue where Christians, Europeans can meet once a year and to talk or to say what actually perhaps should be changed within the European Union, what is not correct, where the problems lie. When preparing the conference, we traveled to the Vatican with Bishop Pieronek, and we saw there in the corridors, walking around in the Vatican, we saw how well recognized he is. Many people know him, respect him, the way that they speak to him. We clearly saw that this is a very special person, a very special authority there. At the same time, well, we saw in the Vatican that he was always considered as someone who was very, very close to the Pope John Paul II. A very important moment in time was the death of Bishop Pieronek. It seemed that perhaps this was the end of our project, but then it turned out that Bishop Pieronek passed away. We remember about him, and he's, well, still our mentor. The idea of this reward is also part of this title, Christian values, and also special identity, European identity, life being governed by Christian values, but also at the same time we need to recognize that Europe, our common Europe, the European Union, are also important, and we want this community to develop, to grow. Today, I believe that although we've been in the EU for 21 years, this educational process, perhaps should be reinforced, because once we joined the EU, we thought we made it. We know everything about the EU and integration, but it's not true. In my view, there is a need to speak about the EU, about integration, to show the different opportunities, what we can learn, what we get from the EU, all those values that are linked close to the EU, and also this feeling of community. For me, this feeling is even more important, community feeling more important than the economic values linked to the membership. 25 years, well, it's a big chunk of my life. Of course, I do tend to be tired, and I think that maybe it's time to stop. But then when I think about the 250 people I meet here in the conference room, when I look at excerpts from the press or go online, when I see some scientific research with links and references to the discussions held here in Krakow in the series of our conferences, and I think maybe it's worthwhile to continue. The conference is needed. I think we all need it, the organizers and also the people of a similar way of thinking. They want to be part of this space so that they know that there is a place, or there are places where such dialogue can be continued, where speaking about Europe is not taken over by, I don't know, anti-European groupings, but we want to speak about it here as well, no matter really the amount of criticism. Certainly, even with criticism, we'll know that it's worth continuing. Ladies and gentlemen, 25 conferences, but we've had only 2 films actually made. Some might remember the first one a few years ago was fairly short, a minute or 2. Mr. Mayor, can I give the floor to you now?
Ladies and gentlemen, so you have been welcomed by the chair, and let me welcome you on behalf of Aleksander Miszalski, the mayor, as well as on my own behalf. I'm really happy to see so many familiar faces in this room. So I've been thinking how to summarize what I should include in the opening, but Jan Olbrycht has already done that before me. I've been quite lucky, I must say. I've been fortunate enough to meet Bishop Pieronek, to spend time with him. At the time, back then, Kraków was a bit different. and Franciszkańska 3. This particular complex was a bit different than it is now. However, I think that certain things will change. We can bear it, and then we can continue about the role of Christianity in Europe in a more open way. I would like to wish a very successful conference. And the winners, I would like to congratulate them on receiving the awards they're going to be presented tonight. This is a new lay tradition here in Kraków, and I hope it's not going to disappear. I hope that the person responsible is not going to stop doing what he's doing. So this Bishop Pieronek's conference will continue, and it will live to see at least its 100th anniversary. Ladies and gentlemen, what does our agenda say? Alois Peterle, a former Slovenian Prime Minister, long-standing MEP. Today, he's representing the Schuman Foundation. Alois, please join us.
Good morning, Eminence, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. I am honored and delighted to welcome you on behalf of Robert Schuman Foundation and its president, Ria Oomen-Ruijten. Robert Schuman Foundation has supported Krakow Conference from its beginning, and I'm happy to remember many meetings with presence of Bishop Tadeusz Pieronek, always accompanied by Rafał Budnik, and these were always very productive discussions, and there was always yes for support of this conference at our foundation. And at many conferences, keywords were freedom, peace, dignity, community, responsibility. I don't intend to speak about statistics, how many politicians, how many bishops, how many subjects we discussed, but I would summarize 25 conferences by saying that Krakow Forum was always a clear and strong voice for stronger Europe. I think we should be more attentive to the change which happened in those years. I remember strong words. I was young, even not yet politician, let's say so. I was politically speaking nobody in the then communist Yugoslavia. I was a second-class citizen, but I remember strong words of John Paul II, who said, "Ne bojte se, don't be afraid." Today the slogan is different, be afraid. And we are afraid. I don't like to speak about drones, but many years ago, man was the question of the man was at the center. Today, we speak about drones. I would like to say that I was not surprised by the victories of the then Christian Democrats, conservative parties, and people's parties after those words of John Paul II, and there was no need to educate Christians about European values at that time. And I said, be afraid are the words of today. We are facing two wars with global nature at the same time. And 25 or 35 years ago, we were discussing the question, what should be the first? Today, the first question is, who is or should be the first? In today's polarized Europe, visions are many times stronger. Slogans and ideologic labeling seems to be stronger than visions and strategies. And I would say that even Christian Democrats, or at least some of them, don't understand anymore why Robert Schuman said democracy will be Christian or will disappear. Because it is so, we need to continue our discussions about the role of Christians in our societies and in the European integration process. We are many here who saw divided Europe, then reunited Europe, and now weak Europe, samotna Europa. And divided as we are in our societies, polarized, we will not be able to build truly united Europe. And with so different understanding of life, freedom, dignity, culture, identity, nation, and other words, we will not be very successful. I think, and I am concluding, we have to agree, what does it mean today to respect human dignity in new circumstances? What does it mean to have men at center? Europe can be lonely, but a Christian, by definition, cannot be alone. Christians should be pillars of togetherness of the community. And I wish this conference lots of success in this regard. Thank you very much.
Proszę Państwa, pan Peterle
Thank you.
nie jest
Ladies
pierwszy
and
raz
gentlemen,
w Krakowie.
it's not for the first time that Alois
Był
Peterle visits
w
Krakow.
2005
His first
roku.
visit was in
To
2005.
była jedyna konferencja,
This was
która
the
była
only conference
trzydniowa.
that actually
I nie
was
zawsze
held over
wszystko
3 days.
robimy bezbłędnie.
Well, sometimes we
Wtedy
do
Alois Peterle był zaplanowany
tend to make
2
mistakes
dnia
because at that
do
time
jednego z paneli.
Alois Peterle was to
Ale ten
participate
panel
in one of the
został
panel discussions on day
przeniesiony
2.
na
We moved actually the panel to
Generalnie
day
nic
3.
nadzwyczajnego.
Well, nothing really
Gdyby
special.
nie to, że można było mu to powiedzieć,
But
a myśmy mu
well,
o tym nie
we
powiedzieli.
never actually told him about this
Wyobraźcie sobie
change. And
państwo,
just imagine,
że
Alois
on
Peterle,
dzisiaj tego nie
he doesn't
pamięta.
remember perhaps this anymore, but
Poleciał
he
do siebie
actually
do domu,
flew back to
na
Ljubljana
spotkanie, które
to
miał
a meeting
mieć
he was to have
niedzielę.
on Sunday.
I wrócił
And then he
następnego
flew back on
dnia
the following
samochodem,
day
żeby
by
wziąć
car
udział w
to
tym panelu.
participate in this panel that was moved to the following day.
I co mi
And what did
powiedział?
he tell
Powiedział
me?
mi, nie
Well, he
przejmuj
said,
się, takie
don't
rzeczy się
worry,
czasami
such
zdarzają.
things happen
To
now
była
and
dla
then.
mnie niezwykła
For me, this
lekcja
was a
pokory.
unique lesson in
Alois,
humbleness.
dziękuję
Alois, thank you
za to,
very much.
dziękuję za to, że dzisiaj z
And
nami
thank you for being with
jesteś.
us here today again.
Zapraszam panią Julianę
And
Zowko,
now, Juliana
posłankę do
Zovko,
Parlamentu
member of European
Europejskiego,
Parliament, Vice Chair of the
wiceprzewodniczącą
EPP
Grupy
Group
Partii
in the
Ludowej
European
w
Parliament,
Parlamencie Europejskiej,
co-chair of the
współprzewodniczącej Grupy Roboczej
EPP
EPL do spraw
Intercultural and
dialogu
Religious Dialogue
międzykulturowego i
Working Group.
międzyreligijnego. Proszę państwa, to
Ladies and
są
gentlemen,
te sprawy,
is
którymi w poprzedniej
exactly,
kadencji parlamentu zajmował się Jan
the area
Olbrycht.
where Jan Olbrycht was
Można
active in the
powiedzieć, mamy
previous term of
następczynię.
his
Tak, Niemcy mówią
previous parliament.
Nachfolgerin. Pięknie.
Nachfolgerin, perhaps. So we've got someone actually following in the footsteps of Mr. Olbrycht.
Thank you very much. It's very difficult to talk after Alois Peterle, who is always buying us with his charm, and we miss you so much in European Parliament. And that was my great colleague and inspired us in tolerance and really great speeches that, but also beautiful music that he used to play. Not only Alois Peterle, but Jan Olbrycht, my colleague and former co-chair of Interreligious Dialogue Group, that is very difficult to fit the space that he left behind as a co-chair of this very important working group in the European People's Party. We are the only group that acts in the last 25 years as a platform for interreligious dialogue and that we provide to churches and religious communities in order to bring the voices from all the religions from throughout the world that are persecuted and that has as a minority issues also in the heart of European Parliament, sometimes that it's considered devoid of religion. So thank you, Jan Olbricht. With your guidance in the last term, that we really started some talk as well on preemptive diplomacy and the peace making, and now we have the new Pope who is also continuing the voice of those who are trying to find a sense in the time that we are facing today. For me, it's a great pleasure as a co-chair of the EPP working group on intercultural and religious dialogue to welcome you to the 25th International Conference, The Role of Christians in the Process of European Integration, A Lonely Europe. It's a nice title, but I don't think that we are lonely. I traveled all around the world, from Africa, Asia, now going to Australia. Many times I've been in the last year in the United States. And I think that we are becoming slowly the epicenter of interest, because all of those who are looking for a voice of reasons are looking towards Europe at this moment. And hopefully the conclusion of this conference will bring us this answer as well. This event has over the years become the first platform to engage with churches, to foster dialogue and to reflect on the intersection of faith and politics. This is happening in Krakow, a historical town in Central Europe. By the way, some say that Croats came from Krakow, White Croatia, so I don't know if that's true, but our honorary consul is saying this. But lots of Polish are coming to Split, where I live, so I guess there is some soul searching. Deeply linked to the vision of St. John Paul II, who tirelessly reminded us of Europe's spiritual root and its mission of unity. Participants from the Western Europe and Eastern Europe, as well as the EU's neighborhood, are gathering together to exchange on the influence of churches on political processes and on the role of religion in addressing challenges. By bringing together leaders from across Europe, academics, and civil society, we ensure that Christian values continue to guide our societies, our policies, and our vision for the future. I'm honored to continue the work of my predecessor, as I said, in particular Jan Olbricht, whose dedication helped shape this working group into a space where meaningful encounters between policymakers and the church leaders can take place. Together, we are building on a strong legacy that highlights the essential role Christian Democrats play in politics, especially in advancing the European integration project. In a Europe that at times can feel lonely, this conference reminds us that dialogue, shared values, and cooperation are our strongest tools. The themes of this year's program speak directly to the question and anxieties of Europe. We begin with the Papal speech about Europe from John Paul II to Francis. St. John Paul II warned us a Europe that would deny or forget its past cannot have a future. His words are reminded that our project of integration must remain anchored in memory, values, and solidarity. At the same time, Pope Francis has called us to look ahead with courage, telling us creative fidelity is needed so that the great ideals that shaped Europe in the past will continue to bear fruit today and tomorrow. This is the compass for our reflections here, not nostalgia, but responsibility for the future. We will also reflect on the crisis of the concept of democracy and human rights, a challenge that called for Christians to stand firm in defending the foundation of our societies. We will ask together, what does a safe Europe mean for Christians today? Safety must also include the protection of freedom and culture. Europe faces also new realities. The old Roman maxim, si vis pacem para bellum, inspires our panel on the effective defense of territory and values, a theme that has gained urgent relevance in today's geopolitical landscape. Alongside this, we cannot ignore that artificial intelligence and big tech bring both opportunities and serious threats to our democratic processes. As Pope Leo XIV has recently warned, while investing in artificial intelligence, we cannot ignore totally the value of human beings and humanity. Let me conclude by inviting all of us these days to exchange ideas, strengthen our partnership, and celebrate the outstanding contribution of those who through the In Veritate award exemplify the union of Christian and European values. And as Pope John Paul II, that I had the pleasure to meet and to organize his coming to Bosnia and Herzegovina and Banja Luka, said, do not fear. As somebody who witnessed the war, exile, and reconstruction, and also peace, I can just tell you, without God there is nothing, and with God there's always a strength and a force that the peace will come, and the peace should be built within us and with our actions, because that's the way that we will protect ourselves. Thank you so much.
Proszę Państwa, gdyby nie
Ladies
wsparcie
and
i pomoc Andrzeja
gentlemen, were it
Halickiego
not for the support
i
of
doktora Adama
Andrzej
Jarubasa,
Halicki
którzy są
and
wiceprzewodniczącymi
Dr.
Grupy Polskiej Partii Ludowej
Adam
w
Jarubas,
Parlamencie Europejskiej,
members of the European Parliament from Poland, vice chairs of the EPP group
proszę
in
Andrzeja
the European
Halickiego,
Parliament from Poland.
najbardziej
Maybe Andrzej
wpływowego
Halicki first, perhaps the most
posła w
influential
Parlamencie
member
Europejskim,
of
jak niedawno Polityko
European Parliament from
pisało,
Poland, as Politico
a
recently
nam
wrote,
doniosła Gazeta
we've been
Wyborcza.
informed about that by the Gazeta Wyborcza
Andrzej,
Daily.
zapraszam.
Andrzej,
Proszę.
the floor is yours.
Dziękuję, ale
Thank you
to
very
trzeba jeszcze
much.
trochę popracować.
We
Szanowni
still have some
Państwo,
work to do, though. Ladies and gentlemen,
Panie
Reverend
Premierze, Panie
Prime
Prezydencie,
Minister,
przede wszystkim
Mr.
drodzy
President,
przyjaciele, dear
and
friends from
most
the
of
European
all,
Parliament and from
dear
the
friends
other
from the European
institutions,
Parliament and other
from the
institutions.
Common Europe. Chciałbym bardzo serdecznie podziękować i pogratulować.
like
25. konferencja to
Welcome
wasze
and
dzieło
congratulate
świetne,
you
bardzo
upon
ważne
this
i
25th
naprawdę,
conference.
Rafale, wielkie gratulacje.
Rafał,
Ja
congratulations.
tu jestem
Quite a
dumny,
lot
że
of good
dokładam małą
work. I
cegiełkę
know that what I'm doing
jako
here is
europarlamentarzysta
but
PO-PSL.
adding but a small
Ale
brick to
rzeczywiście,
this greater building
każdy
representing
coś tam jeszcze o sobie
the
dodaje, to chciałbym
Polish
powiedzieć, że mam
Christian
jedno
Democrat
wyzwanie
parties,
przed
but I
sobą,
know that there is
bardzo
this
ważne.
one
To nie
challenge
związane z
ahead
tym
of me.
rankingiem, bo to dopiero
It
za
is
parę
not
lat
linked to the
przyjdą
ranking,
oceny, ale też jestem następcą Jana
but I'm
Albrechta,
also following in
bo
the
on
footsteps of Jan
wyznaczył
Albrecht
zadanie
because he
kontynuacji
gave me a task
prac
to
nad
continue the
korzystnym dla
work
Polski podziałem budżetu
on the
związanych
EU
z
budget so
projektami,
that it
które
is good for Poland.
mają
It's
nam
all
budować
linked to
także
the projects that are
bezpieczeństwo i
supposed to
możliwość rozwoju.
build
Więc
our
tutaj jako
development
student
and
Jana Albrecht
security.
z poprzedniej
Now,
kadencji
I was
będę
learning from Jan
starał się
Albrecht in the previous
sprostać
term,
temu
so I will
wyzwaniu.
try to live
Ale
up to this task
pytanie
that
i
has been
temat
granted to me.
tegorocznej
Now,
konferencji jest
the
rzeczywiście
subject
niezwykle
and the theme of
istotny
this
i
conference, this
tak
year's
jak
conference, is very important
Peter powiedział,
indeed.
tak, musimy
Mr.
się
Peter
obawiać.
has
Musimy
said
się
that yes,
obawiać,
we need to be
samotności. Ona
afraid.
jest
We need to be
testowana
afraid
każdego
of
dnia.
loneliness,
Testowana,
and it is being tested
doskonale
every
wiecie,
single
każdy
day.
panel
You know it full
będzie
well.
na część
Every
tych
single
testów
panel
próbował
will
udzielić
try to
odpowiedzi,
give
ale
answers
ona w gruncie
to
rzeczy
some of those
padła już w
tests,
tym
but we've
materiale
already heard it.
filmowym.
It's
No,
already been
odpowiedzią
mentioned
jest
in the video.
wspólnota. Ta
So the
wspólnota musi być
response, the
silna,
answer
musi
to
być
that all is
zjednoczona,
community,
musi
which needs
być
to be strong and
sprawna,
united.
musi reagować
And it needs to
szybko i
have
zdecydowanie.
agency, it needs
Czy
to
to
react
jest
and
test
respond
militarny,
swiftly.
który
We
mamy
might be
dzisiaj
tested
właściwie
in the
każdego dnia
military area, and they are happening basically everywhere, every single day.
Czy
The
test
community needs to
gospodarczy,
respond. It might be of
zakładający
economic
cła, musimy
nature.
być
Taxes may be
konkurencyjną
imposed, so our economy
Czy
needs to be
wreszcie w
competitive.
innych obszarach
But also
życia,
in other
gdzie
areas of life,
bardzo ważnym elementem jest też
it may happen
nasza
where our
tożsamość,
identity matters,
nasze
where our
człowieczeństwo,
humanity
prawa człowieka,
matters, when
wolność
human
wypowiedzi,
rights, freedom of
stowarzyszania się i
speech,
tak dalej, te fundamenty,
freedom of association, they
są
all matter.
fundamentami
These are the
naszej cywilizacji,
foundations
to
of our
wrócić do
civilization.
tego głównego hasła.
And now let me go back to the main theme,
integrującej się
the role of Christians in the process of European integration. And I still remember this
W
image.
ostatnim czasie przeczytałem w pewnym raporcie.
I've read this report recently.
Zdjęcie nie do końca
The photo
fajne,
may not
autorskie,
be
muszę popracować nad tą
great.
jakością.
I took it,
Ale
it's quite amateurish. I need to improve my
my jesteśmy
skills there.
samotni
But we
wobec
are
chaosu informacyjnego.
alone in the face of
Już
this
jesteśmy
information
samotni.
chaos
Już
that has
jesteśmy
surrounded us. defenseless when we are looking for answers to very simple questions at times. We are alone when we are choosing our own life path, when we make our daily choices. Why? 7 out of every 10 bits of news either rely on complete falsehood, are completely fake, or alternatively make a part of a major disinformation effort. They might even be created, generated by artificial intelligence, and as such they have nothing to do with actual, real, proper choices that should be made based on access to proper, real information. We have been isolated. We have been truly isolated from actual, true, pure truth. How can we oppose these efforts? You can see these. This is Minorca, and you have those transmitters surrounding the statue of Jesus. But how can we oppose these? How can we shape the Christian and national community that relies and is built of identity and values? How can we do that in this world that is going forward so fast, uncontrollably fast already as it is? I would like to leave you with this photo, with this image. Despite the fact that we should have another panel that would be linked to just that. But it is basically a part of a major discussion on Europe and its integration, and it's going to remain a major challenge to all of us for a long time to come. Congratulations once again. Thank you for the invitation, and I hope that we will be able to continue to celebrate more anniversaries here in Kraków by organizing more of these important conferences, important to you and important to us, members of the European Parliament. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much. Can I ask
Adama Jarubasa,
Adam Jarubas, PhD,
europejskiego współprzewodniczącego
MEP,
polskiej
co-chair of the
delegacji
Polish delegation in the EPP in the European Parliament, to join us now on stage.
Ekscelencje, czcigodni księża, szanowni państwo, drodzy uczestnicy 25. konferencji zwanej Pieronkaliami. Chcę bardzo serdecznie podziękować za kontynuację, panie prezesie, tej wspaniałej tradycji i tego, że właśnie te krakowskie konferencje zawsze odpowiadają na te najważniejsze wyzwania, z jakimi mierzy się współczesna Europa. Przed rokiem mówiliśmy o migracjach, wcześniej o zmianach klimatycznych, dzisiaj o tych wyzwaniach dotyczących szeroko rozumianego bezpieczeństwa. Mówiono już o tym, że wobec tego, że świat staje się coraz bardziej transakcyjny, że te relacje, które Europa miała chociażby ze Stanami Zjednoczonymi, te gospodarcze, militarne, wystawione są dzisiaj na próbę. To jest ten czas, kiedy właśnie te podstawowe wartości zapisane w artykule 2 Traktatu Lizbońskiego powinny być podnoszone i powinny być na nowo odczytywane, interpretowane. To jest wielki test dla solidarności, dla demokracji, tolerancji, dla praw człowieka. To skłania nas w parlamencie do tego, żeby myśleć o tym, jak wdrażać tę europejską autonomię w wielu kluczowych obszarach. Tytuł tej konferencji Samotna Europa. Natomiast wydaje mi się, że jakąś częścią tej odpowiedzi jest samotność współczesnego człowieka.
We need to address also the problem of the loneliness of individuals today in our contemporary world. Establishing contacts on the one hand, but the condition of our relationships in our everyday life very often suffers because of the online presence. But not only. I wish to thank the Pieronek Foundation together with the partners and the European People's Party. I'm delighted that we continue this special tradition of those conferences. If you allow me, I would like to read the words of a letter that has been sent
minister obrony narodowej Władysław Kośniak-Kamysz, który niestety dzisiaj nie może być z nami. Szanowni Państwo, wartości chrześcijańskie stanowią rdzeń europejskiej tożsamości cywilizacji. To właśnie z tej tradycji wypłynęły podstawowe zasady, na których zbudowano europejski etos. Godność osoby ludzkiej, solidarność społeczna, sprawiedliwość oraz miłosierdzie. Dziedzictwo to od czasów świętego Benedykta z Nursi, patrona Europy, poprzez wielkich myślicieli scholastycznych, aż po współczesną katolicką naukę społeczną kształtowało oblicze kontynentu. W dobie współczesnych wyzwań, gdy Europa zmaga się z kryzysem wartości, poszukuje swojej tożsamości, powrót do chrześcijańskich korzeni jawi się nie jako wspomnienie przeszłości, lecz jako źródło odnowy duchowej i moralnej. Proces integracji europejskiej zapoczątkowany przez takich wizjonerów jak Robert Schuman, Alcide de Gasperi czy Konrad Adenauer, odwołujących się do chrześcijańskiej tradycji, nie może być rozumiany jedynie w kategoriach ekonomicznych czy politycznych. Przede wszystkim projekt oparty na chrześcijańskich wartościach pokoju, pojednania i braterstwa. Współczesna Europa potrzebuje chrześcijan aktywnie angażujących się w budowanie wspólnoty, która będzie przestrzenią nie tylko dla bogacenia się i wzrostu gospodarczego, ale również rozwoju duchowego i moralnego. Pragnę wyrazić głęboką wdzięczność Fundacji imienia biskupa Tadeusza Pieronka za zorganizowanie tej konferencji i podjęcie tak doniosłych kwestii. Biskup Pieronek pozostawił po sobie niezwykle bogatą spuściznę intelektualną dotyczącą relacji między wiarą a życiem publicznym. Państwa działalność kontynuująca jego dzieło zasługuje na najwyższe uznanie i stanowi cenny wkład w refleksję nad przyszłością chrześcijańskiej Europy. Bardzo dziękuję.
Thank you very much, and I wish you a very successful conference.
Proszę Państwa, nim przejdziemy do pierwszego panelu, chciałbym jeszcze zaprosić sekretarza generalnego Komitee, księdza Manuela Prieto, który jest od samego początku naszym partnerem przy organizacji tej konferencji. Zapraszam. Manuel, please.
So, dear friends, a cordial greeting to all on behalf of the Commission of the Bishops' Conferences of the European Union, COMICE, as we normally call it. Alongside the Bishop Tadeusz Pieronek Foundation, it's always good to remember him in our meetings with this rose on a chair. Together with Bishop Tadeusz Pieronek Foundation, the European People Party group in the European Parliament, that this year has supported strongly, very strongly, this conference, and the Robert Schuman Foundation, we are happy to be a long-standing partner in organizing and participating in this conference, which is an important space for dialogue between politics, academia, media, the church, and the broader civil society on issues that are of shared concern to all of us. And I would say, personally, that COMICE has been a long-standing partner, even in times when relations were not so easy with the local church here in Krakow. As Secretary General of COMICE, I have been coming to this conference already for some years. It is always a pleasure to be here in Krakow, in this beautiful city, to share our thoughts, our concerns as Christians involved in the process of European integration. The theme of the conference of this year is A Lonely Europe, with at the end a question mark, as also has been said. And I think this is important. From the biography that was given, you know that I'm also a psychologist. So this reality of loneliness is of much interest to me. It affects many people today and has become an important social and mental health issue for our societies. Loneliness emerges due to a perceived discrepancy between the desired and the actual social relationships we have. The subjective feeling of loneliness, though, is not the same and should not be seen as equivalent as social isolation. People can feel lonely despite being in a group or having large social networks, and vice versa. People can perceive no loneliness, although they lack social network. So how can we apply this reality, this concept of loneliness to Europe today? As Europeans, we perceive that we are being left alone, that we can no longer count on partners and friends as we did before. We perceive that we have to be able to stand by ourselves, defending our values and way of life, in a world that has become, at least sometimes we think in this way, a world that has become indifferent and even hostile. Together with this, there is also a feeling that we are losing very rapidly the influence we had in the world. There are other regional actors that have grown faster than us in these last years and are taking the lead. All of this upsets us and sometimes makes us feel frustrated and possibly even angry. We have also to say that this feeling corresponds quite closely to the reality in which Europe finds itself today, of growing isolation and loss of geopolitical influence. To overcome loneliness, we need hope, and a hope that is well-founded. The main hope for us Christians that is solidly founded in the resurrection of the Lord. I don't want to here preach as a priest, but the resurrection is the reality. Our faith in the resurrection is the foundation of our hope. And our hope is a hope of participating in eternal life. This hope changes the way we perceive our lives in the present and the way we react to the different situations which we are faced. It changes us existentially, as Heidegger would say, this Heideggerian concept of a change in our way of being and of being ourselves. And it gives us strength and meaning to overcome moments of darkness, pain, and injustice. Together, though, with transcendental hope, we need also a mundane hope for the present and near future, a hope that is well-founded and can give us orientation. This is also true for Europe. Europe needs hope. Hope to overcome this difficult situation in which we are. Hope that its future will be good for its people. Hope that it will manage to preserve and promote the values that are so dear to us. This hope, though, has to have a solid foundation so that it doesn't become a delusion. St. Augustine said words that I think are important in this idea of hope and faith. He said, "The greatest misery is a hope without foundation." I believe that we Europeans can have a founded hope in our future, despite the situation in which we are. A hope that is solidly founded on what Europe is, on our own resources, on our history, on our people. This is our strength. Europe has always managed to overcome its difficult moments, its crisis, and has done so through unity and solidarity. This year, this conference celebrates its 25th jubilee, 25th anniversary. Also, in the Catholic Church, we are celebrating this year a jubilee year, which is centered in hope. The motto is, Pilgrims of Hope. When the bishops of Commerce undertook their jubilee pilgrimage to Rome in March this year, they issued a declaration entitled, Looking to Europe with Hope. In this document they said, as the European Union navigates these uncertain times, it is our profound hope that it will remain faithful to its founding principles, while continuing to act as a united, trustful, and integrated force for its neighborhood and the world. Dear friends, we are called to withstand the pressures of regressing into isolationism or into the pursuit of narrow nationalistic visions, which are so strong even in this central and eastern part of Europe. It is necessary to rediscover and reclaim with creative fidelity, and this concept was just mentioned by Seljana Sovko, those fundamental virtues and principles that have inspired the very foundation of the European Union, so that while remaining faithful to our roots, we can continue offering adequate policy responses to the challenges of our time. I think that this concept of creative fidelity is a concept used by St. John Paul II in a very important exhortation, which was the fruit of a synod celebrated in Rome, on Ecclesia in Europa, the church in Europe. He uses this concept. And I think this concept of creative fidelity, which means we have to be faithful to a root, but making them actual in this time. Fidelity doesn't mean to stay the same as we were in the past. Also theologically, fidelity does not mean repeating the formulas of the past. Fidelity means, creative fidelity means to make those formulas alive today. So I think this concept can be of inspiration to the reflections and debates of this Krakow conference as we deliberate on how Europe should respond to the challenges of our time. It is my hope that this year's Krakow conference may once again offer a constructive and fruitful contribution. I have in commissary in one of my shelves, bookshelves, I have the story maybe of this conference, of the publications, of the debates of these conferences, and it's really a witness of the work done in the past years. So it's a fruitful contribution we can offer in this conference to renewing the commitment to the European peace project that we have as Christians and to rediscover the important role that we should have in this process of integration. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, dear friends, thank you very much for your introductory comments. My name is Kazimierz Sowa. It will be my great pleasure to moderate panel number 1, but before we do that, I would like to give the floor to Professor Massimo Faggioli. Reverend Dr. Prieto has said that when reflecting about the place of Europe, we need hope that will be based on solid foundations. When we started our preparations on the agenda of this conference, we thought that we would like to invite a specialist such as Professor Massimo Faggioli, specialist on faith, on Europe. We asked him for a few reflections on the teaching of Popes John Paul II and Francis, the words directed to Europeans, to members of the European Parliament, to speak on those messages sent by the popes over the years to those responsible for the political, economic, but also cultural face of our continent. We thought that such an introductory comment might be very interesting for us. Before we move on to the discussion, who could do it better than Professor Massimo Faggioli? Until recently, he was in Villanova, Philadelphia. From this year, he starts his work October, Trinity College, Dublin. He's author of a number of different publications. His most recent book, I'm actually looking forward to a translation into Polish. Hopefully it's going to be published quite soon. Da Dio a Trump. This book from 2025 shows, as I read in the summary, the current crisis of Catholicism in the United States. also perhaps partial responsibility for the shape of the current debate being held. Very interesting. And very often what happens in the United States very often is reflected by what happens in Europe. We will see. Maybe next year we will think about going deeper into this subject. Professor Massimo Faggioli, I wish to invite you to make your introductory comments on the popes and their words addressed to the European Parliament and Europeans. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your invitation, and thank you for this very generous and long introduction. It's a great honor and privilege to address this audience and to have the opportunity to reflect on these topics now. This is my first public engagement after living for 17 years in the United States, and I think it's a divine sign that it had to be Poland, that I had to come and give the first public speech after 17 years in America. I will focus on 3 speeches given by the 3 predecessors of Leo XIV, to and about the European Union. And I will try in a very short time to put them in the larger context of their pontificate. John Paul II, the Christian roots of Europe. St. John Paul II spoke to the European Parliament on the 11th of October 1988. The first non-Italian pope in modern history spoke of the European project, back then with much fewer countries than today, a project which, he said, quote, enjoys increased prestige and authority. It rightly appears to your compatriots as the institution that will guide their future as a democratic community of countries, end quote. He talked about a deep and intimate connection between the Catholic Church and Europe, and of the contribution given by the European project to peace and cooperation, human rights and democracy. John Paul II anticipated that many countries would join the European community. Quote, as the supreme pastor of the Universal Church, myself a native of Eastern Europe, and knowing the aspirations of the Slavic peoples, the other lung of our common European homeland, my wish is that Europe, willingly giving itself free institutions, may one day reach the full dimensions that geography and even more history have given it. How could I not hope for this, since the culture inspired by the Christian faith has so profoundly marked the history of all the peoples of Europe, Greek and Latin, Germanic and Slavic, despite all the vicissitudes and beyond all social systems and ideologies, end quote. John Paul II emphasized in 1988 the key role of the values of civil freedom and of religious liberty. He courageously distanced himself from the distortions that we know happened during the age of Christendom and defended the principle of the distinction between church and state. John Paul II articulated an historical theological critique of the political and religious extremism that I think almost 40 years later has a new relevance today. Long quote, after Christ, it is no longer possible to idolize society as a collective greatness that devours the human person and his inalienable destiny. Society, the state, and political power belong to the changing and always perfectible framework of this world. No plan of society will ever be able to establish the kingdom of God, that is eschatological perfection on this earth. Political messianism most often leads to the worst tyrannies. The structures that societies set up for themselves never have a definitive value. They can no longer seek for themselves all the goods to which man aspires. In particular, they cannot be a substitute for human conscience or for the search for truth and the absolute, end quote. John Paul II here very honestly, in a refreshing way, acknowledged the mixed record of Europe and on the Church on this. Quote, our European history clearly shows how often the dividing line between what is Caesar's and what is God's has been crossed in both directions. Religious integralism, which makes no distinction between the proper spheres of faith and civic life, which is still practiced in other parts of the world, seems to be incompatible with the very spirit of Europe, as it has been shaped by the Christian message, end quote. Now, in a later moment of his pontificate, so that speech was 1988, John Paul II became evidently less optimistic about the evolution of the European project. In the post-synodal exhortation Ecclesia in Europa, which has just been mentioned a few minutes ago, he candidly recognized that Europe was on the verge of becoming a post-Christian continent, in that the gospel must now bring its message of hope to a Europe that seems to have lost sight of it. John Paul II made clear his view of the relations between the Christian tradition and the future of the continent. Quote, in the process of building a united Europe, there is a need to acknowledge that this edifice must also be founded on values that are most fully manifested in the Christian tradition. Such an acknowledgement is to everyone's advantage, end quote. Second step, Pope Benedict XVI. Benedict, the last European Pope, before the election of two popes from the Americas, Pope Francis and Pope Leo, never spoke to the European Parliament, but addressed members of the European People's Party on the occasion of the Study Days of Europe on the 30th of March 2006. Benedict XVI emphasized the role of the Christian roots of Europe, quote, to give a secure direction to the choices of its citizens and peoples. This will strengthen their awareness of belonging to a common civilization, and it will nourish the commitment of all to address the challenges of the present for the sake of a better future, end quote. Pope Benedict was evidently from the very beginning worried about the situation of Christianity in Europe and appealed directly to the European People's Party for a response. Quote, your support for the Christian heritage, moreover, can contribute significantly to the defeat of a culture that is now fairly widespread in Europe, which relegates to the private and subjective sphere the manifestation of one's own religious convictions. Policies built on this foundation not only entail the repudiation of Christianity's public role, more generally, they exclude engagement with Europe's religious tradition, which is so clear despite its denominational variations, thereby threatening democracy itself, whose strength depends on the values that it promotes, end quote. Benedict expressed confidence in European Union with a structured and ongoing relationship with the Church and the religious communities, recognizing their identity, their role, and their specific contribution. And Benedict made a non-confessional, but also non-integralist argument for the voice of the churches and of the Catholic Church in the public square with a remarkable passage, quote, when churches and ecclesial communities intervene in public debate, expressing reservations or recalling various principles, this does not constitute a form of intolerance or an interference, since such interventions are aimed solely at enlightening consciences, enabling them to act freely and responsibly according to the true demand of justice, even when this should conflict with situations of power and personal interest, end quote. While defending the advocacy and the voice of the Church for a legislation, for example, protecting traditional marriage and family, Pope Benedict reiterated that that advocacy was an integral part of the public service of the Church. The Church's action in promoting them was not seen as confessional in character, but addressed to all people, all Europeans, prescinding from any religious affiliation they may have. Now, here Pope Benedict became Pope when already as a cardinal, he had repeatedly emphasized the centrality that Europe had for his worldview. In 2000, he wrote that, quote, Europe is a geographical concept only in a way that is entirely secondary. Europe is not a continent that can be comprehended neatly in geographical terms. It is a cultural and historical concept, end quote. Benedict, just like John Paul II, was not silent on the mixed record of Europe and of European Catholicism when it comes to freedom and liberties and so on, as he did in his address to the diplomatic corps in Vienna in 2007. Quote, Europe has also experienced and suffered from terribly misguided courses of action. They have included ideological restrictions imposed on philosophy, science, and also on faith, the abuse of religion and reason for imperialistic purposes, the degradation of man resulting from theoretical and practical materialism, and finally, the degeneration of tolerance into an indifference with no reference to permanent values. But Europe has also been marked by the capacity of self-criticism, which gives Europe a distinctive place within the vast panorama of the world's cultures, end quote. Like John Paul II, but for the entirety of his pontificate, Benedict saw a crisis of confidence in Europe. What became, in my opinion, distinctive of Pope Benedict's pontificate's view of Europe were two elements. First, a direct counter-narrative against or vis-a-vis the globalization of Catholicism in the sense of a post-European, post-Western, or anti-European, anti-Western view of the future of Christianity. And second, he had a very positive view of the role of religion in the United States, in the public square, as a counter-model to what was happening in Europe. I think this is important because of Benedict's indirect, unintentional contribution to the rise of a certain neo-Orthodox or neo-traditionalist Catholicism in the United States, which is now part, as you all know, of the transatlantic tensions, both at the ecclesial and at the political level. Third, Pope Francis. Pope Francis spoke to the European Parliament early in his pontificate on the 25th of November 2014. This was the second speech of a pope to the European Parliament after John Paul II, more than a quarter century before. In 2014, the European Union had grown considerably, 500 million citizens from 28 member states. Francis, the first non-European, non-Mediterranean pope in history, did not hide his worries for the loss of sense of mission of Europe. Quote, the world itself has become more complex and ever-changing. Increasingly interconnected and global, it has, as a consequence, our world, become less and less Eurocentric. Despite a larger and stronger union, Europe seems to give the impression of being somewhat elderly and haggard, feeling less and less a protagonist in a world which frequently regards it with aloofness, mistrust, and even, at times, suspicion, end quote. Francis had a very stark, a very honest view of Europe, and he emphasized, though, the role of Europe in relations to the modern political understanding of the human person, of which the Catholic tradition has become, in some sense, part. At the heart of this ambitious political project, which is Europe, was a confidence in man, not so much as a citizen or as an economic agent, but in men and women as persons endowed with transcendent dignity. But at the same time, Francis reminded the European Parliament that that transcendent dignity is impossible to hold without true religious liberty. He asked in a rhetorical way, what kind of dignity is there without the possibility of freely expressing one's thought or professing one's faith, end quote? So this memento came from Francis together with the criticism of what he called, quote, a misunderstanding of the concept of human rights and from its misuse. And this is one of the most interesting quotes of Pope Francis ever, not just when he talked about Europe. Today, there is a tendency to claim ever broader individual rights. I'm tempted to say individualistic. Underlying this is a conception of the human person as detached from all social and anthropological contexts, as if the person were a monad, increasingly unconcerned with other surroundings monads. The equally essential and complementary concept of duty no longer seems to be linked to such a concept of rights. As a result, the rights of the individual are upheld without regard for the fact that each human being is part of a social context wherein his or her rights and duties are bound up with those of others and with the common good of the society itself, end quote. So Francis saw in the European project the great ideas which he said seem to have lost their attraction only to be replaced by the bureaucratic technicalities of its institution. And he said, together with this, we encounter certain rather selfish lifestyles marked by an opulence which is no longer sustainable and frequently indifferent to the world around us, and especially to the poorest of the poor, end quote. So Francis made an appeal that was in some sense similar to the one of John Paul II and of Benedict, for a Europe not disconnected and not forgetful of its spiritual and religious roots. But Francis' appeal came in a very significantly changed context. The need for Europe to resist to what he called the spread of many forms of extremism in the world of today, not least as a result of the great vacuum of ideals which we are now witnessing in the West, since it is precisely man's forgetfulness of God and his failure to give him glory which gives rise to violence, end quote. So here Francis made clear the responsibility of Europe in a grave international situation already in 2014. And he said, keeping democracies alive is a challenge in the present historic moment. The true strength of our democracies, understood as expressions of the political will of the people, must not be allowed to collapse under the pressure of multinational interests which are not universal, which weaken them and turn them into uniform systems of economic power at the service of unseen empires. This is one of the challenges which history sets before you today. Pope Francis to the European Parliament 2014. So here Francis wasn't either romanticizing the complex history of the relationship between Europe and Christianity in a similar vein to what John Paul II and Benedict did. And he said this: our history, European history, is a history not free of conflicts and errors and sins, but one constantly driven by the desire to work for the good of all. We see this in the beauty of our cities, and even more in the beauty of the many works of charity and constructive human cooperation throughout this continent. This history, in large part, must still be written. It is our present and our future. It is our identity. Europe urgently needs to recover its true features in order to grow, as its founders intended, in peace and harmony, since it is not yet free of conflicts, end quote. So here, compared to his two predecessors, Francis has a somehow distanced, non-privileged, from a biographical point of view, relationship with Europe. But Europe remained an important point of reference, especially for his understanding of the relations between church and state. In October 2020, on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the establishment of the Comecé, on the 50th anniversary of the diplomatic relations between the Holy See and the European Union, and the 50th anniversary of the presence of the Holy See as a permanent observer to the Council of Europe, Pope Francis entrusted a letter addressed to the Secretary of State, Cardinal Parolin, where he spoke of his dream of a Europe marked by a healthy secularism, where God and Caesar remain distinct but not opposed, end quote. Francis encouraged Europe to find yourself, to be yourself. And that cannot happen without what Francis called, in that letter, the Judeo-Christian tradition. Do not be afraid of your millenary history, which is a window open to the future more than the past. Do not be afraid of that thirst of yours for truth, which, from the days of ancient Greece, has spread throughout the world and brought to light the deepest questions of every human being. Do not be afraid of the thirst for justice that developed from Roman law and in time became respect for all human beings and their rights. Do not be afraid of your thirst for eternity, enriched by the encounter with the Judeo-Christian tradition that is reflected in your patrimony of faith, art, and culture, end quote. 30 seconds from my conclusion. In the approach of John Paul II, Benedict, and Francis to Europe, we clearly see common themes, especially their attempt to resist against the liquidation of the legacy of Christianity by the European project in a postmodernist direction. So there are common themes, but there are also differences of emphasis, especially in the historical and theological views of the relationship between Europe and the rest of the world. Most important, though, of all, are the differences in the political situation between the 1980s to the early 2000s to the first quarter of the 21st century. The acute crisis of liberal democracy, the disruption of the geopolitical and geoecclesial order of the Cold War and of the post-Cold War era, a more secularized and at time more multi-religious continent. But there were also significant differences in the ecclesial situation of the church that these three popes had to govern, a church whose authority has become undermined by the abuse crisis, a papacy dealing with a globalization of Catholicism radically in the sense of a post-European or anti-European church, a church that in many countries is subject to the temptation to embrace populism and nationalism, and I'm referring clearly to the United States here. All this contributes to the development of a papal teaching on Europe in ways that we will have to keep in mind to understand the relationship between our political project, the old continent, Europe, and the first Pope ever born in the United States. Thank you very much.
Professor, thank you for this important, inspiring, and interesting lecture. It helps us to look at the relationship between the Church and Europe differently. Here in Poland, we often look at it through the prism of the teachings of John Paul II. Alternatively, we look at things mostly locally, where various parish priests dictate to politicians what to say, how to vote, or even where to stand in a given church, which position to take. But here we've got John Paul II, and we've got Benedict, and we've got Francis, how they saw, how they thought, what they said, shows that we need to consider different situations that the Church is in. Also, we must remember the foundations of our common values. Professor, thank you once again. Let us begin our first debate. To it, we've invited excellent experts and authors of interesting publications. Victoria Martin de la Torre, the author of the book Europe, A Leap into the Unknown. It is available in the lobby. It is dedicated to the EU founding fathers, great politicians that worked back in the age where the European idea was being forged and when it appeared in this greater cultural circulation. The author has also founded a Foro Abraham. Father Cardinal is also a friend of our conference. He is here for the second time. He is the Metropolitan of Belgrade and Vice President of the Council of the Bishops' Conferences of Europe. Also, we are going to be joined by Klaus Welle, the Chair of the Academic Council of the Wilfried Martens Center, and we will be joined by Wouter Beke, an MEP. He's got very interesting political experience. He's been a mayor twice, then he was a minister in the federal government, in the government of Flanders. Now he's a Christian Democrat politician, representing People's Party in Belgium. Cardinal, I asked him whether he's going to speak Polish because he studied here in Poland, so he's well versed in Polish and in English. In this particular discussion, it's not just that every single sentence, but even every single word is going to matter, so the languages chosen will be the ones that people feel most well versed in. Let us start this discussion with the following. Let's begin with a question, which is the title of this debate. Are we looking at a true crisis of the universal values or concept linked to democracy and human rights? Is it true? Is this a crisis that is being felt in the world of politics? And is this crisis being felt in this cultural concept, in this world of ours, in the EU 2025? Cardinal, thank you very much. Thank you for your invitation. Indeed, I have studied in Poland, but I studied theology. And theology has its own terminology that is somewhat different than the one that is required by political, socio-political discussions that we're going to hold right now. For that reason, I'm going to apologize and I'm going to switch to English because I read mostly in English and I have certain well, terminology that I have at my fingertips and that is easiest for me to use.
I will speak. That was my introductory word because I used to study in Poland. I spent 6 years, beautiful years in Poland. But still, I think that this topic that we are now sharing here is easier for me. I normally read lots of books and articles about this issue, and mostly I meet people who speak in English when we get into discussions. Yes, I can somehow confirm the title of this year's conference, and I am really happy that it has been chosen, this title, because we see that in Europe especially, there is a very strong discussion about the role of Europe, about the meaning of Europe, and in this discussion, as a partial topic, the meaning of human rights and their place in Europe, in the, I'll think, in a global perspective of European political, cultural image and perspectives. And on the other way, there is a crisis of democracy. I could speak more about this crisis and about the concept of human rights and democracy, just leaving the place for many politicians and diplomats. And I think that they can do it much better as myself. So I have to keep to my, let's say, real vocation. I am a church man. So I spent my whole life in the Catholic Church, and by profession, I present the Catholic faith when I speak about the concepts of democracy and human rights. We heard so many very good ideas already in the introduction, and later Professor Faggioli just deepened the concept of the last 3 popes. What I would like to add, the crisis is present, the crisis of the concept of democracy and human rights. What can we do as Catholic Church, as Christians? I think that the most important point would be now to recognize the reasons of this big crisis. We need a process of discernment with cold head, without furious emotions, and with the clear purpose to find out what is moving behind. We heard here the concepts of fear. Last year, a dozen of new books of Europe were published, and one common word and feeling is fear in Europe. We heard Mr. Peterle who said fear. If we, I think so, if we give space to fear, we will lose the most important point, which is in the core of Christianity, and it is hope. So as Father Manuel said, we need hope. So the process of discernment would be to realize, why do we have this big crisis of democracy and human rights? I would like to mention here very shortly the idea that already some of the speakers mentioned. For Christians and for the Catholic Church, it is not so much the human rights, the great issue, but it is the dignity of human person, because the inalienable right or value of human person is the foundation of everything else. Human rights, democracy, everything else, when we respect the human person, and out of this idea, we start thinking about the future or the present of our society. We have to recognize common good. We have to recognize the role of the Christians and especially of the church, and I think about the hierarchy, in advocacy, in fostering dialogue, in disarming the hate speech speech war and all these media which are full of hatred and fake news that we heard already. So we live in a virtual world of lies and trying to get to the truth. And this was the first talk of the newly elected Pope Leo XIV with the journalist after his election on the 10th of May or 11th, something like that, when he said we have to disarm our media, our words, because every war starts with words and finishes with arms. So I think that we will have to continue. It is enough to say these thoughts for the beginning.
Father Cardinal, thank you so very much. Disarming the media is something that we're going to discuss tomorrow, because we'll discuss disinformation and various threats carried by AI to democratic processes. Mr. Beke, Klaus, Welle, gentlemen, a question to you. What's your point of view? How do you see that? Do we still have certain values today that every single European could say, yes, I identify with them, yes, they are my values? Do we have such shared values still? In 1992, Fukuyama published his famous book on the end of history, and he said, certain models have been exhausted, certain models of democracy development have been exhausted, and liberal, values-based democracy is the only one that survived. There's going to be nothing more. 10 years on, the autocracy started basically blooming in Russia. Putin took power. A few years later, Turkey changed its presidency, and the new president changed its country and partly Europe. And then old and new EU member states saw the origin of certain new processes that basically cancelled the idea of liberal democracy. Yes, they might quote liberal values, but they stand in opposition to the values that laid at the very foundations of the creation of this common European edifice. I'll ask Victoria about it later. Gentlemen, do we have any values that link Europeans, those who live in the old EU and the new EU, those countries that live in the European Union and those that live outside of the European Union, even those countries that don't inspire to the membership yet?
Yeah, maybe to start with, I would not take Vladimir Putin as an example for change. Because he's continuing a Russian tradition which has been active for 500 years of central control, suppression, and imperialism towards its neighbors. They started as a city-state of Moscow and have enlarged ever since to the east, to the west, to the north, and the south, as far as they could go. And we had only a very, very brief period, 1991, 1992, 1993, maybe, where we could have the hope that maybe Russia develops into something else. So I think Putin is rather true to his own country's history and traditions, and therefore I would not take him as an example for change. The change, though, is happening in the Western world. And what is happening is that we see the increasing growth of an authoritarian right, both in Europe and in the United States, which obviously is based on different values, and which tries to dismantle democratic checks and balances on which democracy is based. Because if you have managed media, if you put pressure on the justice system, as we see for the moment in the United States, for example, if let's say representatives of past administrations are threatened with legal proceedings, to be put in jail or to have to pay high sums, then democracy is at risk. So our values, democratic values, are threatened by an authoritarian right. Since 2009, we can see this in the European Parliament growing. 2009, maybe linked to the financial crisis 2008, surely also linked to the development of social media, which means that we have lost common reference points. When I grew up, every German was watching at 8 o'clock in the evening the main news. And then we could disagree. You know, we disagreed a bit to the left, or we disagreed a bit to the right, or we found this fantastic, but we had a common reference point. Nowadays in society, we don't have common reference points anymore, because everybody is in his own little world and confirmed with his own views. And it's very difficult to talk in this society. And that concerns both Europe and the United States. And sociologically, what we are seeing is the revolt of the lower middle class. Because if you have a look at the electorate profile of parties like AfD or Le Pen or FPÖ, for example, it's very, very similar. These are people overrepresented among the unemployed, overrepresented among workers, overrepresented among those which have not a very high level education, and to obviously have come to the conclusion that the globalized world has not been working for them. Has been working probably for us, but maybe has not been working for them. So they go for alternative options, which unfortunately look very much like the past. It's both in America and in Europe, more or less in old countries, somewhere between 25 and 30% of the electorate. The difference is, with 25 to 30%, in America you can capture one of the two main parties. And that's what the MAGA movement has done with the Republican Party. In most of our systems, 25 to 30% is not enough. And we have seen in France that everybody else came together. But in France, it could be enough next time. And in Britain, you can govern as a Labour government with 34% of the vote and more than 60% of the seats. So we have a similar development, not specific to Europe, but to the, at least to the Western world, if not going beyond, if we think of India, for example, where we see the growth of an authoritarian right that's trying to hollow out democracy and our understanding of human rights, and that growth has not yet finished.
Thank you very much. In this debate, Wouter Beke, I will ask you in a moment, but first, Welle, a question to you. In this debate, you are threatening us with the right and with various right-wing radical views. And the right wins quite often because it shows various theories and postulates that are leftist in origin. And they at times can be deemed ridiculous or even empty. These postulates may be at times even asocial. You can see it in Poland. Sir, you are right when you say that 25 to 30% of the electorate is enough to dictate the political narrative in the main political parties. We see it here too. In the right-wing roots, Law and Justice, but you can see it in the platform, which is a Christian democratic country. You can see it in Germany too, in CDU. There is this shift to the right in the German CDU, isn't there? Often you hear that certain authoritarian or right-wing postulates are taken over by mainstream parties, but some leftist postulates help to build the radical right. Do you agree with this postulate?
Given that it was a relatively long statement. I can't agree with everything. Sorry for this. What I think is we have identity politics on the right and identity politics on the left. The identity politics on the left are around issues like gender or race, if you want so. And the identity politics on the right are around nationalism. And sometimes, if I look at the US, I also have the impression around race. So the democratic space is encroached on by identity politics from the right and from the left at the same time. And I met yesterday somebody who is going to publish a book in France about right-wing wokeism. So the moderate space is being reduced by the non-moderates on the right and the non-moderates on the left who try to introduce identity politics.
Wouter Beke. Well, this week we had a speech of Donald Trump in the General Assembly of the United Nations, and when I was looking to this speech, I thought we always have thought that the Western way of life and Western values are the same as the European way of life and European values. But after this speech, more than ever, I was convinced that there is a big difference. And this is also an opportunity for us as Christians, as Christian Democrats in Europe, because this speech had nothing to do with human dignity, nothing to do with solidarity, nothing to do with reconciliation, nothing to do with real freedom. And so there is a big difference between a Christian and a European way of life, inspired by Christianity, and a Western way of life, who is a way of life of individualization, of secularization, of materialization, and so on. And so there are opportunities. As Christians in Europe, we are, of course, very modest. But in the Eurobarometer, 44% of European people call themselves as Catholics. Dear colleagues, if we would have 44% of the seats in the European Parliament, we would have not 188 seats, but 130 seats en plus. That would make our life much more easier. And so what I want to say is that, of course, the explicit role of religion, of Christianity in our daily life in Europe is less visible. But it's still there. And we have to use it. We have to pronounce it. Because if we don't do this, the extreme party will do this and will misuse it. And like the professor quoted Pope Johannes Paul II, well, if they use this, if authoritarian regimes use religious issues, then it is for their authoritarian sake. It's not for the common belief, it's not for the common good. And so I think that there are, for us, more than in the past, because of the coming up of authoritarian regimes, because of the coming up of Trump, but also in Europe, there are challenges to pronounce us more than we did in the past, to be less modest. And I know that's not so Christian, but we have to do it. And I think we have to pronounce our legacy, but also our respect. I give you just one example. When Pope Francis died, there was a moment of remembrance in the European Parliament. There was also a moment of remembrance in the Belgian Parliament. And in the European Parliament, from the far right to the far left, they all spoke very respectful and with dignity. And of course, all of them with their own perspectives. I mean, far left was talking about Pope Francis as an example on the compassion of asylum seekers, and far right was speaking about Pope Francis as an example for ethical issues as abortion, but it was all with respect and with dignity. In the Belgian parliament, at the same moment, there was also a moment of remembrance. And there was not that kind of common ground. He was attacked because of abortion points of view. He was attacked because of his compassion on asylum seekers. And so when I was sitting there, I was involved 20 years in national politics. I thought, I'm lucky to be a member of the European Parliament and not of the Belgian Parliament anymore. And so that is just an example, but we have to use this. I will give you just a small other examples, because we are now in September. Everybody is back to work after moments of stay in, of weeks of stay in holiday in Europe. Yesterday evening, I asked here at the lobby of the hotel, can you tell me where is the center of Krakow? And they told me, yes, you have to go to I wrote it down, the rival colony, the center of Krakow. Well, in the center of Krakow, but also in the center of every big city. If you ask where is the center of European cities, they always say that's the place where you have the church and the town hall. Always in Europe. If you ask in the United States, where is the city? They say, that's in the shopping mall. If you ask, I just came from Kuala Lumpur, if you ask it in Southeast Asia, they always say, that's in the place where the shopping mall is. But we don't pronounce it explicitly. Christianity is part of our cultural heritage. Let's explain it. Our monasteriums, for example, they are part of our Christianity. One of the previous speakers spoke about the rule of Benedictus. Ora et labora. Well, grace to Benedictus. Benedictus and our monasteriums, that were the first internet where knowledge came over from city to city, from town to town. The universities came from Catholic grounds. And so we have to be proud, a little bit more proud of our cultural Christian roots. And my main message is, if we are not, then the far right will take it over. And not for the common good, but for strengthening and make stronger their authoritarian thinking. And that is a very big danger.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting comment about what you said also about this center of the city and about culture and development of European cultures. Yes, the town hall, the church, very often located in one place, and the market square. Here in Krakow, we've got the market square with the town hall tower and St. Mary's Church, and the town hall in the very center, actually, here, the first early shopping mall from the Middle Ages, here in Krakow, in the very center of the main square. Victoria has written a book about the beginning of Europe, sort of prism of the founding fathers. What I found a bit surprising on the one hand, but on the other, very charming, was the description of the personal relationships between the people behind the idea of common Europe. Schumann, De Gasperi, Adenauer, the personal links, and also the way in which they very openly said that they were Christians. And this model of the future European community is very much based on Christian values. When we were speaking about our agenda for this conference, what was also mentioned, what was also very interesting, an eminent philosopher, Jacques Maritain, He played the role of, I don't know how to define that, someone who has been asked to prepare when there was discussion in Paris in 1948, discussion about the Common Declaration of Rights of Human Rights, individual rights, about perhaps a moral side of the document. He was asked Maritain, his role, very important. I was not aware of that. Can I ask you this question? Those values at the foundation of the Common Declaration of Human Rights, those at the foundation of the EU core documents, were they truly based on the Christian values because there were perhaps no other competitive values? Or maybe this was a conscious choice of the founding fathers. And today, looking at what happens in Europe, Schuman, Adenauer, Di Gasperi, would they be happy actually about the current developments, about who we are?
Thank you very much for the question, which is very complex. But I think that it's really linked to the question that we ask ourselves in this panel. And I think that we can learn a lot actually from Schuman and De Gasperi, who are both in the process of being beatified. And when I read the speeches now and the short book that Schuman wrote, I realized that a lot of the struggles that they faced at their time, especially already in the 1930s and after World War II, some of them are coming back. So we can learn really a lot, even when they discussed the question of defense and peace, and also the crisis of democracy. And one philosopher that was instrumental for this change, especially for Christians in Europe after World War II, was Jacques Maritain, because today we think that there's an obvious connection between Catholics and democracy, but it was not like that in the turn of the century. Actually, at the beginning of the 20th century, most Catholics were anti-modernist, but because the Catholic Church at the time was anti-modernist. So there were questions about democracy, because still, especially in France, what they thought is that the French Revolution had actually killed this Catholic France. And it was the same question for human rights, because was at that time, for example, like freedom of conscience, freedom of religion was not obvious, because the church said at the time there's no right to error. So both Schuman and De Gasperi really found inspiration in Jacques Maritain, who I think that in his life he embodied this transition of Christians. Because when Jacques Maritain was young and he was studying philosophy at the Sorbonne, he was an atheist. And then he converted to Catholicism by studying philosophy. And then he became a follower of a movement in France that was Action Française. And Action Française was a nationalist movement at the time, like Catholic. But what they were saying is that they wanted to define who a real French was. So Jews were not real French, so communists were not real French, so it was an exclusivist. And at one point it was Pope Pius XI who had to condemn Action Française and explain that the Catholic is universal, so it cannot be nationalistic. And also that religion cannot be instrumentalized to spread hate, because we are all brothers and sisters. So that's the whole point of being Catholic. So we have to try to build bridges and build on fraternity. So Jacques Maritain then, he thought, okay, I need to follow the Pope and what is happening here. So he followed the advice of Pope Leo XIII, who had recommended to Catholic intellectuals to go back to St. Thomas Aquinas to try to see how modernity could be somehow embraced also in the Catholic Church. So Jacques Maritain really, I think that he was humble enough to rethink everything in the light of St. Thomas Aquinas. And in the light of St. Thomas Aquinas, he realized, first of all, that there's more than the individual, there's the person always linked to the community. And this is why, of course, the person is free and unique, but is also interdependent with the rest of the person in the community and therefore responsible for them. And the other thing that St. Thomas Aquinas said is that because we are made in the image of God, every person with her reason can identify the moral good. So there are some truths that are revealed, but any person from any religion or no religion can identify the moral good. And this is the basis on which we have to work. So when Jacques Maritain was asked to work in the preparatory work for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, this is what he took, that in every civilization, in every spiritual tradition, there is some moral good. And for those of us who are engaged in interfaith dialogue, this is the golden rule, that in every religious tradition, there's this rule that don't do to others what you wouldn't like them to do to you, or phrased in a positive way, do to others what you would like them to do to you. So it's really empathy and reciprocity. So he engaged in this work, and I think that because it was after World War II and after the Holocaust, there was a window of opportunity for such declaration, because we were so ashamed, and especially in Europe, that we needed to agree on some basic humanity. And they managed to agree on these foundations. And Jacques Maritain said, and this is in a very interesting book by Marianne Glendon, so they say, okay, if we agree on these principles of human dignity, let's not argue about the roots. And this was a little bit also the mentality of the founding fathers. Like, let's not claim that if you arrive to something good, and we know that this is Christian because this is good, but other people find other reasonings, but we find the good, let's just agree. We don't need to put like this label that it has to be Christian. This is fine. And I think that in a way this is the basis of this discussion, because I don't think there's a universal concept of democracy, because democracy is something that we all agree on, and we make it into a law of how we want to live together. Whereas human rights is based on this human dignity that is not granted by any state or any law, but it's natural law. Like, if we all agree that we are born with these rights, and on this, then we will build the legislation. And this constructed legislation may change, but the concept of the rights cannot change, because then it becomes a crisis of anthropological crisis. And I think that this was a little bit in the previous interventions. So what is man? If we start redefining human rights, if we want to include other things, then it means that we are deteriorating this image of man. And I think that on this crisis of like anthropological crisis and what man is, we have our own crisis in Europe. It's not only coming from outside, because we know, for example, like maybe in some Muslim countries also now they're challenging the Universal Declaration, but we in Europe are also challenging it when we want to add new supposedly human rights. So just going back to, because then we could see how Schumann and De Gasperi really lived up to these values, and how I think that they had this idea of like St. Thomas Aquinas, that we can dialogue with others to find the moral good, and also that actually we should be open and to interpret the spirit and try to find the best solution for the common good, not because we are Christians, but because we are Christians, we want the good of all.
Well, very interesting what you said, and I fully agree. I think that you don't need to believe nowadays or in the resurrection of in heaven to recognize that Christianity has played a fundamental role in our identity, in our culture, but also in our democracy. I would even say more. Without the Catholic doctrine, without the social teaching of the Church, there would not be a Convention of Human Rights as we had written after the Second World War, with the inspiration of Jacques Maritain and other Catholic thinkers. And the 30s were very inspiring for that moment, because it was a very challenging time for Catholic thinkers in the coming up of Nazism, fascism, communism. And they were thinking about how do we get our Catholic engagement in this kind of societies. And that was fundamental in the personalistic thinking of Jacques Maritain, of Emmanuel Monnier, of Emmanuel Levinas, and so on. And so it was this kind of thinking that brought us to the European Convention of Human Rights. Very important. Second, democracy, it's the book for the paradox. Democracy is about norms, obligatory norms. It's a set of rules. But democracy has to be embedded in values. Democracy, as such, don't deliver values. It has to be embedded in values. And in our society, Christianity and Catholic thinking can embed this kind of values. And of course, you have also other sources, but this is our main source. And why is it so important to reflect on, can we say nowadays that these sources comes from Christianity? You can talk about the water, but you will not stay to talk about the water when you don't respect the resources of the water. And that's the same with our values. That's the same with our thinking. And if we don't do this, and I come back to my previous point, what is the difference between Christian democratic thinking and talking about Christianity and authoritarian thinking and talking about Christianity? The biggest difference is that we are challenged by, not by an absolute leader. We are challenged by a belief. Authoritarian regimes are challenged by an absolute leader. That's the definition of an authoritarian regime. And that's the reason why it is so dangerous when they take up our kind of thinking.
Thank you. Several times there was reference to common invariable principles. Among others, human dignity has been mentioned. But at the same time, in the Western world, especially in Europe, there is also discussion about this notion of human dignity. Well, the very beginning is about the question to the beginning of human life, right to life. We should respect human life from the very beginning. But on the other hand, the right to freedom is stressed. Also, the right to freedom when sometimes perhaps mistakes can be made. Pope Francis was criticized. It was very interesting. It was mentioned also your experience from the European Parliament and the Belgian Parliament. It was a very interesting example, and the reference to the Pope. Many people, words full of praise and criticism, being open or criticized for stance on migration or others. Same in Poland, roughly. We also had that. There were some criticizing the Pope, then they were happy about some other views, and vice versa. This was quite common about the approach of the Pope to migration, for instance, or human life and so on. Why do I mention that? We will always, I think, be having a big discussion about the fundamental principles and trying to define them. And here maybe a question to Cardinal Nemet. When you are asked, Cardinal, do we still need the 10 Commandments? What do you start with? What do you say? Do you say that this is divine law given by God to men? Or maybe you try to explain it in a slightly different way, in a more secular way, perhaps?
No, it is a challenging question. 10 Commandments are surely very important for our civilization, which stems from the Judeo-Christian roots. And most of them are still full of value, even for the general public, let's say in this way, for our cultures. But not every one of the commandment is respected in the same way as we would like to hear it, or it was described in the Bible. So this is the difference, that many commandments are present, but they are changed in their meanings, starting from the first one till the last one, and somehow even, as you, Father, mentioned, this fifth commandment, do not kill. We know that there is a very big discussion about the first moment of life and the last moment of life. That means abortion and euthanasia. These are the two very big issues which are somehow present in our culture in Europe. I don't know whether in the United States with same intensity. It means for the end of the life. For the beginning of the life, pro-life and against abortion movements are extremely strong, and they are surely somehow part of the success of MAGA and the present President of the United States. What is important for us as Christians, as I mentioned, we have to make a discernment and find out what is the real situation of our teaching and whether does this teaching correspond to a certain normal development of the, not of the truth, but of the understanding of the truth on our side. Just the question of abortion. It was mentioned Saint Thomas von Aquinas, and Thomas of Aquinas taught in his Summa Theologica that the human person starts after the first 3 months. So the embryo was no one, nothing. 3 months later, it just became something like a human, and only a couple of years after the birth, it became a person when it started using intellectual power. We know that we have today totally different teaching, and mostly thanks to Holy John Paul II, it is clear now in the Catholic teaching from the first moment of conception till the last moment of biological, let's say, normal life, as till the death, although it is discutable what is death and when you arrive to it and when do you live and how do you live. But we take it as a fundamental truth that it is the value of human life which is deciding and decisive for the understanding and for European culture. Although we have already a couple of countries where euthanasia is allowed and abortion is allowed. I think even in Poland is in a certain ways and situations possible. But in most of the countries it is allowed, even in Europe. So we heard how many Christians there are in the parliament. I always ask how many Christian teaching is in the decisions of the parliament. So it is something, yes, there are two different realities. And I heard from Ms. Della Torre that the role of the Catholic Church, and it is true, till the Second Vatican Council, the Catholic Church was very much against freedom of religions and against democracy. And I'm not sure that even today that democracy is the best form for the Christian life, because we are in a process of development. And the Catholic Church started speaking about democracy only after the Second Vatican Council. These are 50 years, 60 already now. Exactly, this year, 60 years. So we have to be careful in the Catholic Church not to put the stress on one single political solution or order for social life, because it is not so sure that it is universal. And I used to work in the Philippines. The democracy in the Philippines was totally different as the democracy in Europe. And in the Anglo-Saxon world of the overseas region, democracy is understood differently, and the role of religion differently in that part of the world. And I see here the real danger that the question of God and question of right Christian behavior will be taken over by influencer and not by the people who really live their faith. And this is something which we have to take. And the crisis of universal values and concept is really not so much crisis of universal, but crisis of the core democratic society and values that we have. And thank you for bringing up this question about life.
Cardinal, you've mentioned influencers, but the Church is really happy to see influencers as the ones who spread its own vision of the world and its values. We also need these influencers. At the same time, we might see somebody who becomes more often heard than the bishop. But the Catholic voice in your home may come only from the bishop or from the Vatican or a parish priest in extreme cases.
Qualities of the bishop. So not every bishop is on the level of his vocation, or he should be on the level of his vocation. And I know that a bishop today should stick really to his core job and not to comment everything and everywhere, or to keep the right on the truth for himself. And I hope that with this new process of synodal changes in the Catholic Church, there is a working group on bishops' responsibility, transparency, and accountability. And I hope that we will somehow get a stronger control in the Catholic Church on the bishops and their behavior.
By the way, on the margin, Pope Leo has nominated the new prefect. He is a lawyer. Victoria?
Yes, no, I would like to go back to this idea of democracy as not being the only form of government, and it's true because it's something that has been created by humans, and maybe in the future there will be another form. But I think that so far it seems to be the best one. And I think that there's even empirical research on the good effects of democracy for the living together, the quality of life, human development, because we as persons, we aspire to fulfillment and to development. And on this, also, I think that Jacques Maritain inspired the Catholic Church to say that democracy is not just an instrument, but it's a moral good in itself. And I think that this is very important now in the discussion about different views of what a Christian Europe is, or what a Christian democracy is. Because if we understand democracy as working only if we can attain our goals as Christians in the society, I think that this would totally undermine the whole value of democracy. Because the point of democracy is that as a system, it's a moral good, because it really is a way to recognize the human dignity, because it's based on participation, that all persons should equally be able to participate in the democracy. And this is why Maritain, Schumann, De Gasperi said that it has its root in the gospel, and only because of the gospel we can have democracy. Because before, no one said that all lives are equal, like men, women, slaves, free men. This was really revolutionary in the gospel, and this is the basis for democracy, because it really allows everyone to participate. But it also means that if we accept it as a moral good, sometimes we will lose in the democratic system. But this is something that we need to accept as a frame. And there's a book, because this is a question that I also had myself. And I remember that I read a book by a professor of the Santa Croce, Universidad Santa Croce, Martin Ronheimer, in which he explains why, what can be the relation between Christianity and this secular form of state. Thank you.
Yes, maybe to add on what Victoria has been saying, if we look back to the last 100 years of European history, then the moments of huge catastrophe were in fact the moments of collective ideologies. And that could be the collective of the class in communism, or that could be the collective of the race in National Socialism. And when you take the collective as the starting point, it means that the individual person can be sacrificed. And there are no human rights. And as we see now for Vladimir Putin, it's not a problem that hundreds of thousands of Russians are dying, because they have to serve the eternal Russia. So, and that's why it's so essential that every person has the right to be represented and to be taken into account equally, and that it's not more important that we have a collective, might it be called race, might it be called nation, might it be called the class, which is more important, and that's why the individual can be sacrificed. So democracy is the institutional precondition for human rights.
A very interesting and important words, and the thoughts that you, Klaus Welle, have formulated. And here, I would like to invite you to a bit of reflection. Let us reflect on the future. It's going to be future studies in action. Imagine the following. In a few years' time, not a distant future, after the election, it turns out that in the EU member states, especially the biggest ones, we have in power political parties and political milieus that quote what's already been mentioned, namely this radical right-wing vision of the world, and how, what role people, AfD in Germany, Le Pen with her front in France, possibly Confederacja in Polish, in Slovakia, Fico's party is already in power, in Czechia, we might see a political change. The same is true about Spain and Italy. So, why am I asking that? These milieus will reach power, take power, through using democracy. They will be elected by people. They might have 5 or 10% of votes of advantage, but they will take power. So democracy will work. The winners will be those that have the strongest social mandate. And then Europe and possibly the European Parliament will face a redefinition of human rights and citizens' rights. My question is, how do we, as Christians, respond to that? It's a hypothetical, but it is feasible. It is something that has happened in a number of countries. You know, these might have been smaller countries, politically speaking, less important, but we could see a democratic tsunami that will change the political face of Europe. Well, today we have liberal democracy, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is something that was used to lay the foundation for the European community.
Yeah, I see you are inviting us to have a nightmare. And of course, as a German, I know that there are situations where you have democracy, but you have democracy only once. Democratic elections. We had this in 1933, and we know what was the outcome of this. But I don't want to compare what is not comparable. So I think we have to also hope that some of these political formations are moderating on the way, because it is absolutely fair to have different views in a democratic spectrum, as long as you don't try to destroy democracy itself. Different points of views have to be discussable, and they can come to power. That's what democracy is all about, as long as they don't try to destroy the system itself. And we have seen interesting movements. In Italy, for example, Meloni came from a very different background, and I would say nowadays she's leading the most stable government in Europe, and very constructive, and nobody is criticizing her. So that should be welcome. And at the same time, on the left, we've seen Syriza in Greece during the financial crisis, which started off with a very extreme program, and finally introduced what was necessary for the country to stay in the euro. So this hope we always need to have.
Victoria?
Victoria?
Yes, well, since I'm not a politician and I only like to read, I take inspiration in Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, when he wrote this book, Salt of the Earth. So I think that when, like maybe, like as Catholics, we're not in power, all we can do is try to be ferment, no, in society, and that's also not only for people in power, but I think for every Christian person, because we are all called to participate also as citizens so try to be salt in the earth, and then also try to be creative minorities, as Pope Benedict also used to say. And then this is an advice from De Gasperi, that he has this amazing speech that he gave in Brussels in 1948 in the Grande Conférence Catholique about the moral basis of democracy. And he says that it's very difficult to defend democracy, and he wrote that at a time when really there were lots of forces trying to undermine. And he said that there's always a temptation to become nostalgic and to look at the past. But he said that for Christians, the solution is always in the future, and our hope is not only the resurrection, but also knowing that Christ is Lord of history, and that there is providence, and we only play our part. But he said, what we need to do is practice our merciful patience, because and just stick to the democratic principles. Like, let's not fall in the temptation of abandoning or like believing that it's not possible, because as I say, that Christ is there, and we have to try to remain faithful to our own values.
But let me also say that there will be Christian on both sides of those political elections. Christians will vote for those that have radical mottos, and they will vote for those who believe that they defend what? What do they defend? What they know? What we believe is a better solution? So yes, I agree, we see an invitation to a nightmarish vision that might take shape. When I look at the Italian political life, I share your opinion. This is one of the most politically constructive EU member states. Yes, we had our concerns, but you know, we cannot say the same thing of other countries.
Well, I want to bring in some elements. First of all, let me quote Shakespeare. He said, in this sad time we must speak what you feel, not what you ought to say. And that is what we have to do, speak what we feel. At the Conference of Malta in 1944, Stalin asked to Churchill and to Roosevelt how many military divisions the Vatican has. But it was the Vatican, it was Pope Johannes Paulus II, who turned down the communist system of Stalin without military divisions, but with a conviction. And so that's my first point. Second point, democracy is not just the rule of the majority. Democracy is not just having 50 seats plus one. That is what Trump is thinking. His mind is, I am elected as president, so I can do what I want. But that is not democracy. Democracy is also respecting the rule of law. Democracy is also respecting minorities. Democracy is also respecting the individual dignity mentioned in the European Convention of Human Rights. That's also democracy. And so democracy is a lot more than just thinking, I'm in the driver's seat and I can do what I want. Third element, I'm coming from Belgium, and a former Prime Minister of Belgium, a liberal, Guy Verhofstadt, some of my colleagues will know him, he was for, and he is for the United States of Europe. Well, I'm not for the United States of Europe, because we have our own history, we have our own member states, we have our own traditions and so on. But moreover, in Europe, it will not so easy to have something what happened right now in the United States because of that. And that's also why I am not so in favor of this kind of thinking of a superpower with one man or one woman who is at the driver's seat and can decide whatever he or she wants. In Europe, we have another kind of system. It's more a deliberative system. And of course, we are often thinking it's not going fast enough and so on. 2 weeks ago, we had a report on the Draghi report, and it has to go faster and faster and so on. And there are a lot of things to say that we need to get faster, but in getting faster, it can also getting faster in the wrong way. And so the deliberative democracy that we have in Europe has also his advantages. And I think that we also have to pronounce this kind of advantages, also in in the nightmare that you are mentioning. Last element, it's not the core business right now of this conference, but I just want to highlight it. The biggest challenge for Europe, I think, is that we are now getting a weaponization of the member states, rearmament because of the threat of Russia, and so on. And we have to do it because we can't count anymore on the United States. But, and also our party leader, Manfred Weber, he mentioned this several times. The biggest challenge of Europe is having a rearmament of member states and the upcoming of extreme right. The extreme right wind blowing in Europe and the rearmament of the member states, that is the biggest threat. And that's the reason why, and it's a personal point of view, I'm for a European army, because only with a European army, only with a European defense, we can prevent this.
Księże kardynale, no co z tymi chrześcijanami, którzy są po dwóch stronach?
Cardinal, what about the Christians on both sides of political choices? Everyone seems to be convinced that they vote in the right way. This seems to be in accordance with their conscience.
No, it is not only a Polish problem. It is all over, I think, in the beginning in the States, where we have a democratic system of election. Most of the Catholics were on giving their vote to President Trump. And in Europe, we are seeing this same direction in many countries. We remember the elections in Poland just a couple of months ago. And Poland is the third biggest Catholic Christian church in Europe after Italy and Spain. And still there were so many really interesting results and interesting talks before and after. I would like to go back in this way to Pope Francis. And Pope Francis has a beautiful encyclica, Fratelli Tutti. It is not so much quoted, because Laudato Si took everything, and everyone speaks about Laudato Si, because you can speak about trees, about frogs, about everything else which is surviving in Europe. And this is the ideology of Greens. It is very much passing to Laudato Si. But Fratelli Tutti is a real masterpiece of love, philosophy, gospel, and universal human values. Universal, because it was written under the influence of his dialogue with non-Christians. So he discovered some universal values even outside of the Christian framework, which does not mean that it doesn't come from God. It comes from God, because we believe that God created everything, everyone, and every religion, even if he or she has other names in different cultures. But anyway, that there is a fundamental human set of values which can be put under the title Fratelli Tutti. And I can imagine that this is the real challenge for Christians, to sit down and start talking without really entering in verbal fights, provocations, trying to calm down and talk not so much with emotions, although I agree that we have to be emotional when it goes about our values and Europe, but still we need a rational discussion, a rational discourse. And it is very, very difficult in our society to do it, and we see it all over. But the worst, I would say, weakness of Europe would be to give up this part of our common culture. And when we look at the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, if I am not mistaken, incredible. At that time, people were able to agree for a free religious practice. Naturally, it was not understood as today, because the boss was taking everything. The winner was taking everything. So that was another solution. But for me, it is even today shameful that the only major power in Europe at that time who did not sign the treaty was the Holy See. So we need really in the Christian world a right approach, a discernment what comes from God and what is the will of God in this present moment, so that I think that for Europe, we maybe don't need a super state or anything else, but we need a community of nations where even my poor country, Serbia, will be accepted. We are still somewhere not Europeans. When I arrived to a Schengen from there, are you a European? Yes, I'm a European. Oh, I show him, but you are not a European. I'm a European. But you are not European because you forgot that Europe is bigger than the Union. Thank you very much.
Europa, Europa.
Of course, Serbia is Europe. Very interesting comment, also in the context of Laudato Si, and also many words of criticism for Pope Francis, that he moved in a somewhat surprising direction for some, maybe. As our time is limited, maybe another question. First of all, Europe. Is Europe attractive in the context of some values that we can offer as a reference point for others, perhaps? For the countries or societies still outside Europe, what can we actually offer to those outside? Because China offers investments, big money. Russia, more and more, goes back to where it was 30 years ago or so. We also can see very intensive, how shall I put it, also in the context of different ideas. America being very active, spreading their ideas. And now the question, Europe. What can Europe offer to the world that we would say, yes, this is important, this is interesting, we would like to take it over? Thank you.
Yeah, you raised the question, are we attractive? The European Union has many, many, many applicants. How many applicants has Russia? Russia has to take their neighbors in by force because nobody wants to come. So we have many applicants, but Russia has no applicants. Does China have any applicants? Not that I'm aware of. So we have applicants. And why do we have applicants? Because if we look back in history, the world was a world of empires. And empire meant a big country swallowed their weaker neighbor. And if you look at the map of the 19th century, you see the French Empire, the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg Empire, and they had swallowed all the smaller nations. And when you look at the map today, we have 27 nation states in the European Union. So the European Union is the precondition for this multitude of nation states we have in Europe. It's the guarantee of the nation state, not the opposite. If the European Union would not exist to protect and to provide common structures, we would be back to empire, and countries like Russia would swallow their neighbors again, as it was the case during most of our history.
Well, I just came back from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, because I am head of the ASEAN group. It's a group of 10 member states in Southeast Asia, Singapore, Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, and so on. 700 million. We just announced a free trade agreement with Indonesia. We are negotiating free trade agreements with the Philippines, with Malaysia, with Thailand. 700 million people. And I talked with them. And yes, we are attractive. And why are we attractive? We are attractive because in Europe, the rule of law is important. It's not discussed like it is in the United States. Multilateralism is at stake. International institutions and international agreements is quite important. The dignity, and not only in institutions, but also talking with dignity, what we don't have seen in the General Assembly of the United Nations, is also important. So, yes, we are attractive, not because we are an economic giant, because we are not an economic giant anymore. We are 6% of the population worldwide. We are 6% of the pollution worldwide. We are 15% of the world's GDP, 50% of the social expenditures. That's our part in the world. But yes, we are a reliable partner. Second element, the real threat for almost all the countries, except the United States maybe, except China, except India, is that the new role, the new geopolitical and geoeconomic order is the order of might is right. That's what Trump is thinking. That's also what Xi Jinping is thinking. And we only can have a counterbalance, a counterpower when we work together. And it's not only Xi Jinping and not only Trump. It's also the biggest companies in the world. I've written a book, Crack Up Capitalism. Who mentioned it? It's a very good book. You have to read it. Do you know that the 6 biggest companies worldwide, it are all American companies, their worth is more than the GDP of the European Union. And so what we see in Europe with the Digital Service Act and so on, with a lot of acts that we have taken to protect our citizens, to protect our companies, it is this kind of companies who are saying, we don't want this. You have to follow our rules. Well, do you think that a member state alone, and this is what Klaus Welle also said, do you think that a member state alone has the power to say, no, we will stand for it, even with the terrorist race? And I know that there is a lot of fuss about it, the deal, and you can say we had to close a better deal, but I met the Singaporean Minister of Trade in the European Parliament on Wednesday, and they said, you negotiated very well. I don't think that Belgium would have a terrorist rate of 15%. But because we did it together, we could have a better deal than the friends of the United States. And that is something also that is mentioned by these ASEAN countries, for example. They say, okay, we now we are thinking about the same kind of regional institutions like the European Union, because we We see right at the moment that only when we do it in this way, we can have a counter force, a counter power against the biggest countries, but also against the biggest companies. And that is the only way that we can protect. The only way that we can protect our citizens, our companies, and our values.
To był głos politycznej strony, a teraz...
The voice of the political world, and now Cardinal Church.
Europe is attractive, and I speak to many migrants going through Serbia, because Serbia is on the Balkan route, and since 2015 we have been very much engaged in this kind of apostolate, working with refugees and people in need. And I am sure that Europe has something which is very important for most of the refugees. It is religious freedom, so that they can practice their faith, whether it is Islam or any other form of religion or Christianity. So that's one of the things. The second is security for their families. Is an extremely important factor for refugees to have a secured life, where they can send their children out on the street, that they are sure that they will come home without violence, that they are sure that they can somehow live according to their own convictions, and not always being afraid what is going to happen if I say something, if I think something differently. So I think these are so small things that Europe has really developed extremely well and presents a very nice style of life, not taking into account all other things. And I will finish with just a talk with a migrant. He died on the route, on the Balkan route, and come to the heaven. And Peter accepted him at the entrance door and told him, "Come in, my friend." And he went in, and Peter told him, "Here, the left, this is hell. To the right, it is paradise. Where do you want to go?" And he asked, "Peter, where is Germany?"
Victoria, same question.
Czy Unia jest atrakcyjna? Czy Europa, nie Unia?
Is Europe, maybe not only the EU, is Europe and Europe's values still attractive?
But I would say, I would speak about the European Union. Because what I was thinking, that the European Union, I think it's attractive because it exemplifies a different way of relations between countries. And what we see now, it's like the questioning of every international institution. And again, we're going back to relation between countries that is only based on like strong power. And for years, Europe has been, the European Union, first of all, has been a model of reconciliation. When we think like relations between France and Germany, I think it gives hope even to like Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Palestine. This was the hatred that existed between French and Germans after World War II, and we came here. It's hope because we had a divided continent. No one would have thought 70 years ago that the European Union today would bring together these 27 countries. So, like, hopefully we can also show the world that there is a way to relate between countries that is based on equality, on rules, and on like democratic means that respect the dignity of each person, but also of each country.
Bardzo ciekawe. To ja tylko bym dodał, że rzeczywiście kiedy się popatrzy na te...
Very important, thank you very much. Also, well, I'm wondering, looking at the population flows after tragic events such as the war in Ukraine, for instance, over 3 million Ukrainians moved to Poland, Germany, also other countries, Portugal, Italy, I think as well. And they were looking for refuge there. They were looking for some space where they could live, develop. About 8 million, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, about 8 million Ukrainians live outside Ukraine. Very few of them moved to Russia. Some of them were forced maybe to go to Russia, or some maybe for other reasons selected to leave Ukraine for Russia. When you, Cardinal, said about your experiences about migrants, why migrants want to be here in Europe, you spoke about freedom and also equality. Well, you started, you, Cardinal, with the words liberté, égalité, the French Revolution, but sécurité also, well, you said security, that's very important, certainly. Very interesting. If we look at our history in Europe, well, Europe used to be a unity, perhaps. In the Middle Ages, we had a unified Europe, although, of course, there are kingdoms and borders in the Middle Ages. They kept changing. Well, difficult for us maybe to imagine today. There were, of course, changes, conflicts, changing of borders. But still, we had unified Europe because it was unified by one language, Latin. Universities that attracted students from different parts of Europe. If you look at the map of, for instance, those universities, it's very clear. Plus, very important, one religion at that time. Then we had the Enlightenment, new ideals. They're also based very much on what we mentioned, the first Declaration of Human Rights linked to the French Revolution. Then rebirth of national states in the 19th century. Poland was divided, partitioned, but Belgium, other countries were reborn at that time. Reunification of Germany, and then the 20th century, two big wars, of course, but the second half of the 20th century, Victoria mentioned the reconciliation between France and Germany. This reconciliation would not have been possible were it not for perhaps Adenauer when he was returning after his journey from Italy. He visited Schumann, actually. He visited his home, and they met and spoke. We are celebrating now the 60th anniversary of reconciliation between Poland and Germany, and it would not have been possible were it not for Cardinal Kominek at that time in the Vatican. He actually spoke to bishops from Germany. Recently, we had a very interesting discussion in the Polish Senate on that, on Cardinal Kominek, where he actually addressed and asked the German bishops, asking what can we do together to be brothers again? So Polish and German reconciliation. And today, if we look at the demographic data about the countries from which we've got the greatest numbers of tourists visiting Poland, these are Germans. Many Germans come for shopping to Poland, others come on holiday. This is the case. That's the way it is. And additionally, well, perhaps, Klaus, I am delighted that you actually made the correction concerning Russia and Putin, because in Poland we think that the Germans are Putin verstehers, but critics also. There are also some critics. Not all Germans understand, luckily, and tolerate Putin. So we look at Europe, sometimes we are disillusioned, sometimes disappointed. Well, it all depends perhaps on the expectations that we in Poland had. But in the social media, there are sometimes different pictures, as you know, sometimes very vivid. And I've seen some similar pictures also from the Czech Republic and Poland. For those against actually the EU. Czech Republic at the time of communism, a Czech town at the time of Soviet times, this gray photographs, and the Czech town or city today, beautiful, colorful, flourishing. At the time of the EU, some say that we are slaves to the EU. The same for Poland. Have a look at photographs from Krakow, our city from 1989, and today, also Warsaw. Huge differences. Also Belgrade. I was recently to Serbia, Belgrade, and I was really surprised. I must say, what a wonderful city Belgrade is. Maybe too many Chinese and Arabic signs everywhere, but Russian also. Well, ladies and gentlemen, our time is almost up. Our tradition is such that there is also some time for questions from the room. Igor, the floor. Yes, you can ask the question.
Thank you very much. Igor Shaba from Kyiv in Ukraine. Today, we are hearing quite a lot about crisis and about human rights. Crisis, human rights, a crisis linked to human rights. Cardinal and you, panelists, a question to all of you. Yesterday, we had this discussion with Jan Figel. how to love your enemy. It's a Christian postulate, love thy enemy, is it not? And it seems that the Church does not tell current Christians how to do that. We have not heard the right response there. And it's linked to manipulation. Should I allow people to kill me? Should I allow somebody to cross this threshold and kill? Do I defend myself? Am I obliged to love? My church, Greek Catholic Church, issued a certain document stipulating that I, as a Christian, may not defend myself. However, I am responsible for my family. I'm responsible for my children, for elders in my family, and I'm obliged to defend them. So, Cardinal, I think about your position and that of the Church. Is there a line in the sand when I'm obliged to love my enemy and when I, as a Christian, take a different stance? It is a bit of a crisis of modern-day Christianity. Very interesting question. Thank you for that. A very complex one. It may seem to be simple, but Jesus told us to love everybody, everyone and anyone, and there were no preconditions to that love. This is a universal truth that is valid all over the world, in any situation, in any context. Obviously, it's a bit different when it comes to nations or individuals being attacked, which is the case in Ukraine. So, who has a right to defend themselves? A country, a state, may always organize itself and has this moral responsibility for the peace and security of the whole nation. When you start from that point, you may reach the issue of individual responsibility. Every Christian has a right to say no. Even during World War II, you had Germans and Austrians who said no, and they were shot because of that, whether they had families or not. But I wouldn't link that with the responsibility for your family. Yes, you have responsibility for your family, but every love begins with yourself. Love your enemy the way you love yourself. There is no greater love. You can give your life for your brother, but this is something extra. There is no responsibility there because some people may not understand it. You may defend yourself, but no one has a right to murder, which is another teaching that has developed in the Catholic Church. 40 years ago, the Catholic Catechism was drafted, and there we read the following. The state has the right to have capital punishment. In the current teaching, we read that no one has such right to deprive, to issue such a punishment, to deprive somebody of life, to punish them. Today, we think that they're drones, so we don't bear any responsibility for people, but it's not true. Human nature has not changed. We are what we were. So, Orwell was right in his description in 1984. So if you are well skilled in persuasion, you can convince somebody to kill even their own mother. Any comments from you?
Maybe I would answer on this. By the way, I will also continue this evening to go to Ukraine for the next 3 days. But what does it mean for me, love your enemy? I think it means when you look at the aggressor, so Russia or Russians, that you uphold the hope that in the future they could also be different. And now I'm thinking of my own country, Germany. I mean, if people had not thought after 1945 that Germans could also be different than they behaved during the Nazi dictatorship and the Second World War, reconciliation would have been impossible. And there was enough reason not to believe that Germans could also be different. But to uphold the hope that even those who aggress you today and to try to kill you today could also be different one day, that would be for me the practical meaning of love your enemy.
Victoria?
Just because I read this speech by De Gasperi, in which he refers to the situation in which they were discussing the European Community of Defense. And De Gasperi was a strong defender of the European Community of Defense because they were afraid of Russia. And in this speech he says, we need to have this strength because we need to be protected, while we have to keep working for peace. Because he said that those who want war are our enemies today because they want to undermine our civilization, and we should, at the same time that we protect ourselves, we should always try to keep in mind that in the long run, we want them to engage in this civilization. So I think that this can be maybe the perspective.
So that has been theory, and that has led to something very practical to the here and now that is happening in Europe. Vittoria Moderatore, Klaus Welle, Wouter Beke, Cardinal Ladislav Nemet. Thank you.